This is Amateur Hour. I'm Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and with me is Mark Edward. Mark runs the website BibleDarkly.com, which is like what I do, an amateur's perspective on the Bible, although Mark does it much better. He goes more in depth.
And less frequently.
Well, that is true. You are very infrequent. But it's worth the wait. So what have you been up to? How have you been? Just give me a rundown. What's been going on?
Well, I've been well. I have not blogged a lot recently, but I did have a recent post, which is kind of what sparked this decision to have another one of our video get-togethers. But I've been trying to branch out a little bit, just learn more about other religions, and then hopefully whenever I get back to really digging into the Bible, it'll maybe give me some new perspective on what I'm reading. Not necessarily that I expect there will be a lot of crossover, but at least open, my brain to considering new ideas.
Yeah, we've dialogued off. Well, I guess we're technically online, right? By text, is that online? But about some of the things you've been reading, and we'll probably hit that at the end. But yeah, you've been reading some interesting stuff. So stuff that's definitely not in my wheelhouse, I guess. You know what I mean? Like it's not stuff that
some of it's really not in my wheelhouse, but I just wanted to see what's out there that I'm missing.
Yeah, branch out. Yeah. Well, one of the reasons, like you said, that I wanted to have this conversation, and what we'll talk about, there's two main things that we're going to hit today. The first is your post on the connection between the Book of Revelation and the Epistle of 2 Peter, particularly chapter 3 of 2 Peter, which is probably one of the most famous passages in the New Testament, at least in terms of eschatological expectation. No, in my Reform days, it was part of that was quoted frequently as an anti-Calvinistic, not willing that any should perish. But we'll get to that. And then the second topic we're going to hit is probably one that is more interesting, especially for some of my audience. Both of my viewers will appreciate it. But we're going to talk about the Christology in the Gospel of Mark, particularly as it pertains to how many readers of the Gospel of Mark, especially evangelicals or Orthodox Christians, read those texts as speaking of a divine Jesus. Usually some kind of Trinitarian Jesus.
And I think you've been wanting to have that discussion on camera for like 3 years now.
Yeah, because I love the Gospel of Mark, first of all, and I'm really interested in how Mark portrays Jesus generally. And I've written some blog posts on this, and but yeah, so let's start with your post on Revelation and 2 Peter. So what was the impetus for writing that post? Like what was your thought process? What got you interested in the connection between the two?
Well, so this is the connection between the two, or a potential connection between the two, is something I have honestly had in the back of my head for about 20 years. Like way back, all the way back when the world was young. And I'm getting into Revelation and like learning to read it outside of a very strict fundamentalist point of view, and exploring first preterism and then eventually academia at large. And I'm starting to read more of the Bible outside of just the Gospels and just Revelation, because at the time I thought most of it was pretty boring. Which honestly, that's still the case, but I love it. I saw what seemed to be this really unusual overlap between Revelation, specifically chapters 20 and 21, and 2 Peter 3. And this was coming from somebody who had not really read 2 Peter at all, except for just occasional Bible pop quizzes in youth group or early college church. But the gist is that Revelation 20 and a little bit of chapter 21 and 2 Peter 3 have a handful of details that are clustered together that you don't really see anywhere in ancient Jewish or ancient Christian literature unless they're dependent on revelation. And those details are the mention of 1,000 years, the arrival of a final judgment by God after that 1,000 years, destruction of evil or whatever by fire, and the end of the old creation, old heaven and earth, and replacement by a new heaven and earth. And then as a little bonus, Revelation and 2 Peter are one of just a couple of books in the New Testament outside of the Gospels that use the phrase or the idiom that the end times will come like a thief. That it'll be a surprise like the way a thief strikes.
Yeah.
And these are just like, they're so tightly clustered together, these little details, that I always wondered if there was some connection between them. Like, did Revelation borrow from 2 Peter? Did 2 Peter borrow from Revelation? Or was there something behind the two of them that they each drew on? Like something very specific. And for 20 years, I had no answer to this. So it always just sat in the back of my head, and every now and then it would pop up, and I would, I don't know why, I just never really dug into it. Mm-hmm. And then a few weeks ago, I decided, you know what, I'm going to see what's out there, what I can find. So that's where this came around. I think it's been about 4 months since the last time I wrote a blog post. So it just kind of dropped out of the sky here.
Yeah. The last post you wrote was another post on the Book of Revelation. Yeah,
of course.
May 28th, is that right? Yeah, May 28th. You have an affinity for the Book of Revelation for sure. It's appears to be something that you're deeply interested in. So let's talk about the connections, because when I first summarized your piece, I misread you completely. I was thinking that you thought there was a indirect connection, not a direct connection, but an indirect connection between Revelation and 2 Peter, because, and correct me if I'm mistaken, your view, and I think this is probably the consensus view among scholars, is that 2 Peter is a product of the 2nd century, probably mid-2nd or so. The book of Revelation is late 1st, early 2nd. So if there was any kind of dependence, it would have to be in the direction of 2 Peter depending upon the book of Revelation. That's just how the time works out. So I had misread you as saying that you believe there was an indirect connection. Not a direct connection. It wasn't that he was actually relying on Revelation. And I should note that for those who think Peter wrote 2 Peter, the dating alone, based on
he wasn't alive around 150 CE.
Yeah, if he died in the
Second Peter, for anybody who is not aware that's watching, 2 Peter is regarded by most scholars as the last book of the New Testament in terms of chronology. It was written roughly 50 years after Revelation of John, and maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years after most of the other late books of the New Testament.
Yeah, and it also shows dependency on the Epistle of Jude. And this is a controversial idea. Even Richard Bauckham in his commentary notes the dependency of this Petrine author on the Epistle of Jude. It's just, in fact, I invite anyone to just read the two letters and note the similarities. It's uncanny.
I have a page on my website that gives the entirety of Jude and shows all the direct parallels in 2 Peter.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah. So, and again, for anybody, I'll put it in the show notes, but BibleDarkly.com, all this stuff can be found. So either way, so I was mistaken in my summation. You messaged me to rebuff me. I don't appreciate the name calling, Mark, but it's okay.
It slipped out.
It just, yeah. I've never seen the F word so many times. Either way, so what you were actually arguing is that they had a common tradition, a common, I guess you could call it a source. And so what is the source? Why should we think that's the case? And let's go from there.
Well, so like you said, Jude is almost entirely, not the entire letter of Jude, but most of it is reproduced in Second Peter. Not strictly word for word, but you can very clearly see which parts are being copy pasted.
Yeah.
So the way I approached this was, well, to see if there is any kind of dependence in Revelation by Second Peter, I should just go through the whole letter and see what other texts the author of Second Peter seems to be borrowing from.
Yeah.
So Jude is the obvious one. So I just find all the parallels with Jude and kind of check them off and set them aside, and then look at the remaining text of Second Peter. There are several passages that, in my opinion, show a strong likelihood the author of Second Peter used the Gospel of Matthew.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
Specifically Matthew, not Mark or Luke, but Matthew in particular. He could have also had Mark and Luke, but Matthew's the one he's using.
Yeah.
And when I did this, I also noted, hey, Revelation actually has some parallels with Matthew that seem to show the author maybe knew Matthew, or at the very least, some kind of, people hate this phrase, oral tradition related to Matthew. But Matthew specifically.
Yeah.
So then I take those and I set those aside. What else do we have? Well, really, other than a handful of other passages that make sense as original content by the author of Second Peter, what we have left is just that section that has the parallels with Revelation. Well, then that really strongly seems to be, he's pulling, all of these other parts are being pulled from something, and he has this really conspicuous overlap of whatever nature with Revelation, maybe there is something behind the two, or something to connect the two. Mm-hmm. So by itself, that doesn't give much to go on. You just have to, like, well, what's to look for behind them? You know, how do you find a source behind them just by guessing that there might be one?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out there have been scholars who posited a source behind Second Peter for that passage. And the way they get there is really, some of their critics have said it's like kind of a strained logic, but in my opinion, it's pretty compelling. That Second Peter features a particular word in Greek that it's not very common in early Christian literature. You don't see it almost anywhere in the first century, except for possibly the Didache, if that passage in the Didache is from the first century, which it might not be. Yeah. You see it in James, but James has been very strongly argued, I think, by Dale Allison, to be a product of the early second century, roughly 100, 110. Yep. And then you see it in texts like First Clement, which is late. You see it in The Shepherd of Hermas, which is late. Second Clement, which is also late, and doesn't seem to be directly dependent on First Clement, even though they have they're attributed to the same author, but they're not written by the same person in reality. But so you have this cluster of texts that use this really particular word, dipsukos, which means two-minded or double-minded.
Yeah.
Two-souled.
Yep.
And the way that they use it, they all use it in the sense of somebody who proclaims to trust God but behaves in a way that they don't.
Yeah.
And so the scholars who have tracked down this weird word and its usage in all these texts, they start to notice, hey, there's this actually really weird overlap in perspective and language between Second Peter, First Clement, Second Clement, James, and Shepherd of Hermas. Not just this word dipsukos, but a handful of other related words, and they all show up again in little clusters. Where we find dipsukos, we find nearby this other word or this word that we don't find in other parts of these books.
Yeah. So
it seems to be that whatever they're pulling this weird dipsukos word, they're also pulling some of these other weird, rare words from. And then in the middle of each of these sections of these different books, we have them quoting from unknown sources or source. So we have James, chapter 4. He's quoting something, he calls it scripture, But the thing he quotes is not anywhere in the Hebrew Bible,
Yeah.
and it's not in any other text that we know about. And then we have First Clement and Second Clement each quoting a passage about ancestors doubting. And again, the quote that they provide, it's not in any text that we know about. And then we have the Shepherd of Hermas, where he also quotes a book, but he gives us the name. It's a book titled The Book of Eldad and Modad, named for two prophets from the Book of Numbers. Well, now we have a key, this reference to these two prophets. They only show up in this one passage. I think they're mentioned in one paragraph, and that's it in the entire Bible. But conveniently, it's about people claiming they trust God, but they don't based on their behavior. And Moses is summoned by God along with 70 elders to have a little meeting to deal with this topic. And then suddenly Eldad and Modad show up while the elders are away with Moses, and they start prophesying. And Moses' successor, Joshua, is like, hey, what do we do about these guys? Are they real or fake? And Moses says something to the gist of, God wishes everyone was as jealous to have his spirit of prophecy the way that these two dudes have. So that's his way of saying, like, yeah, they're for real. They have Yahweh's authorities in them. So like this context in the Book of Numbers fits what we find in these other passages that come from an unknown book or books. And when we start to look in other traditions about Eldad and Modad that have been preserved in other literature, it all starts to kind of piece together that we have this non-biblical story, a midrash about Eldad and Modad that survived in oral tradition. I think we can be very confident it survived orally first and was written down by separate people later, which would explain why it's not identical between these sources, but similar enough. But we have passages in the Talmud from different rabbis where they talk about Eldad and Modad did this and that, and one of them gives a summary of the prophecy that they delivered about the end times, and it touches on a lot of the little details that we find in Second Peter and in Revelation. So the gist of my article is that Second Peter and Revelation of John, neither one of them was dependent on the other. Second Peter very likely did not use Revelation of John, but I think it's very likely Second Peter used the book of Eldad and Modad before it was lost. And I think it is possible the Revelation of John may have also been influenced by the same tradition, perhaps even before, or maybe not before, but from a more oral rather than literary direction. That's the end result.
Yeah. Is the so this book of Eldad and Modad is the 2nd century CE, like with the Shepherd of Hermas, and is this the last known, like when it must have been extant, like to our knowledge, or do we find it anywhere else? Or
there are references to it. Well, there are the references in the Talmud to prophecies in like known to rabbis and Jewish folk from Eldad and Modad. So they probably had this book available to them in some capacity or another. And then, if I remember correctly, one or another scholar, I think Richard Bauckham is actually one of them, lays out some of the evidence that the book of Eldad and Modad may have been known as late as the Middle Ages.
Really?
It's just really unfortunate that we don't have it anymore. But that's not unusual. The Didache was known for centuries, and then it just disappeared for nearly 1,000 years before it was rediscovered in the 19th century.
Okay. So this is all really. It reminds me, when I was a kid, there was a TV show called In Search Of. I don't know if you remember that. Leonard Nimoy was the host.
Yes. Yep.
So you would have these. I think maybe a couple episodes. I think it was that show where they would talk about lost texts of the Bible, and so Eldad and Modad. I don't think that was ever one of them, but it's the kind of book that conjures up within me this kind of nostalgia, but also this like, oh, it's not, it's gone. It's like we're missing information. We don't have the whole story. So it just reminds me of that. So this written text. Well, do you think these rabbinic sources are talking about? I think you've alluded to this. Are talking about an actual written text, because you provided some quotations in that blog post. And it looks like they're referencing mainly just the tradition, right? Are they actually lifting any quotations from the text that you know of, or
one of them? So I pulled in 3 examples, and I think there were more. In the Talmud and the Targums also. I shouldn't say just the Talmud. Where you have them providing, like these rabbis will outline, here's Eldad and Modad, and here's what they said, and here's where they came from, and then here's why they did what they did, and here's the things they predicted. And in each of these passages, they follow almost this formula for how to introduce these 2 characters, what they were doing, and then what they said, and the order in which they said it. It could be that these guys are, these rabbis, or the scribes of these rabbis are just really that great with their memory.
Yeah.
I think it's more likely that they had some manner of text available to them that they're dependent on. It doesn't have to necessarily be the book of Eldad and Modad. They could just have a catalog that gives a synopsis, like key points that helps them remember what was in that book. We know such things existed, like, for example, the Muratorian canon.
Yeah.
But given the fact that they're almost in lockstep, here's who they were, here's what they did, here's how Joshua reacted, and here's the things they prophesied, this, and this. It's always these 3 things: this thing about Moses, this thing about the quails, and then this thing about Gog and Magog. The fact that it's always this pattern suggests to me personally, like, my interpretation is that they had a written source available about these 2.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that for sure. Okay. Well, let's not linger here for too long. I really want to get into the Christology of Mark, but in fact, let's just jump right into that. Unless you got more to say about this, I really want people to read.
No, that's it.
Read the post. And
my ultimate conclusion, if you don't want to read it, is 2 Peter did not use Revelation. I think 2 Peter probably used the book of Eldad and Modad, and that book may have also influenced the Revelation, but they're each getting their information from it in a kind of roundabout way. That's really about it.
So then let me just, because I'm just thinking through this. Revelation, 2 Peter, these Shepherd of Hermas, James, these are all texts that are end of the first, into the second. Why do you think, if you have any thoughts, why is there suddenly this very obvious to you and other many scholars too, influence of this text on these authors, but we don't see it as much in other New Testament texts that are like we don't see it in Paul, we don't see it, to my knowledge, in any of the synoptics or even John. Is there something about the 2nd century that's unique, or do you have any thoughts on that?
So 3 of these texts, wait, let me count my brain. 4 of these texts have some manner of connection to Rome, in the sense that they were written near or in Rome. Shepherd of Hermas was explicitly written in the vicinity of Rome.
Yeah.
First Clement is written from the Church of Rome to the church in Corinth.
Yeah.
Second Clement, I believe, it has been suspected of being written in Italy, but there are hypotheses of other locations like Alexandria, Egypt, for example. And then 2 Peter, of course, follows after 1 Peter, and 1 Peter names Rome through its cipher Babylon.
Yeah. Yep.
As being the location it's coming from. So there's this really weird conspicuous connection between several of these texts to Rome, and then of course there's the Revelation of John, which is a scathing rebuke of Rome, written in Asia, but Rome's on its mind.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder if this book primarily circulated in the the northern part of the Mediterranean, Italy, Greece, Asia, and it didn't really catch on in more southern parts of Mediterranean, such as Egypt. That's just my guess, though. I don't know for sure. And I from what digging I was able to do, I did not recall seeing any speculation on where the book may have been written or where it circulated. That's just a connection I happen to notice.
Yeah, okay. That answers my question. All right, well, let's move on to the Gospel of Mark and the Christology of Mark. So, first of all, what are... well, we're going to get into some individual texts. We'll probably hit the 4 main texts just for the sake of time. But there's obviously a variety of reading strategies when you approach the text. And evangelical Christians tend to read the Gospel of Mark in a particular way. The Christology of Mark is, I would say, a lot more subtle than you might find in the Gospel of John. Although, I mean, that's debatable. But I think people are so used to seeing like the big passages like, John 3:16.
I am the gate, I am the true vine.
Yeah, text like that where it's kind of just Jesus is just this over the top divine figure from heaven. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us, that kind of stuff. So,
and he has an explicit description of his descent into the living world in John 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I'm trying to figure out how I approach this, but what? Well, actually, let's start with some text. Let's start with some text and go from there, because I think that's just a great way to, begin the discussion. So let's start with Mark chapter 1. And the first few verses, so I'll just read them. This is from the NRSV updated edition. So here we go. Mark 1, verses 1 through 3. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was an evangelical, I could read this passage in such a way that it identified Jesus with God, such that Jesus, in Mark's view, was understood to be God.
Right.
And the argument tended to be, you look at the context of the original passages, especially Isaiah, when he says, prepare the way of the Lord. It's John preparing, it's John the Baptist who's making this proclamation. He's talking specifically about Jesus, make his path straight. If memory serves, it's in Isaiah, it's make straight a highway for our God. So I would have read it as, see, Mark is equating Jesus with God implicitly in this text. Therefore, he must have, in some sense, been a Trinitarian or a primitive Trinitarian or whatever you want to call it. So,
right.
How do you read this text in Mark chapter 1? Do you think that argument holds any water? What do you think Mark is actually doing here?
I think that interpretation is probably the weakest of the ones available that I can think of. I understand the thought process, but I think it's wrong. The gist is the reader is making a mental substitution where they see the word Lord in that quote from Isaiah. They read Lord as both Jesus and as Yahweh, and therefore Yahweh is Jesus, or Jesus is Yahweh.
Yeah.
And I would say a lot of them don't realize they're making this mental substitution. And if they are aware that they're doing this, that they're cognizant of the fact that they're reading Lord as both Yahweh and as Jesus. Most of those people, I would say, are not aware that the word Lord can just mean Lord.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be like, not every time that we see that word does it mean Yahweh.
Yeah.
Including in passages that are being quoted from the Hebrew Bible. The readers of the New Testament very freely, the authors of the New Testament very freely quote parts of the Hebrew Bible out of context. They will take passages that have nothing to do with what it's originally talking about and make it about something else. And I think that they find more leeway in doing that because they are quoting from the Septuagint, which is Greek, where all references to Yahweh have been replaced with the word Lord. And the word Lord is also used for many, many humans who are not divine in any capacity. It's just a word referring to a social superior of some kind, whether that's God, a king, or just a dude who owns land and you don't. So because there's that, you could call it ambiguity in the Greek text about who this Lord is. We don't even know if the author of Mark, in quoting Isaiah, knows it's about Yahweh. He could just think it's about the Messiah and that the Messiah is a human person.
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of the argument turns on the idea that Mark had before him the entirety of the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
And that,
which I don't think the evidence supports that.
No, I mean, yeah, he might have, but I mean, to have that in Greek, I mean, it would have cost money to have that. He was probably among some of the elite because of his reading ability and his ability to write, but that does not entail that he had a copy of the Hebrew Bible. So, yeah, he's taking snippets, he's doing it from memory, but like you said, he's doing it in Greek, and the Greek word kurios is obviously, polysemous, right? You said it can mean many different things. But you made a point in your post that I thought was astute about the first part of that prophecy, where it says, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way."
Yeah.
That's not from Isaiah.
No.
Right. Where does that come from?
Mark attributes this prophecy he quotes to just Isaiah, but it's at the very minimum a combination of a passage in Isaiah and a passage from Exodus, maybe also blurred a little bit with a passage from Malachi. But in those, in the very least, in Exodus, and if not also in Malachi, the word messenger in Hebrew, as well as in Greek, it's the word for angel.
Yeah.
So if he says, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you," and if messenger is John and messenger is angel, then John is an angel. In the same way that Lord is both Jesus and Yahweh.
Yeah.
Like if we apply the exact same thought process through the whole quote that Mark provides, then we have to consider John to also be a divine being, just a lesser one than Jesus.
Yeah.
But since I think it's safe to say that that's a pretty ridiculous interpretation, but that's the one we should come to if we're being internally consistent with the way we are reading this text. If our hermeneutic is consistent, that should be the conclusion we come to. But it's not, because it's absurd. That's not what Mark is saying. Because again, he's freely misquoting this passage from the Hebrew Bible for his own ends. So instead of that interpretation, instead of the interpretation that Lord is Jesus and therefore Jesus is Yahweh, or that John is an angel, Um, there are at least three other interpretations that I think are more likely. Excuse me. One is that, yeah, this passage is talking about God, but it's talking about God when it says the Lord. John is preparing the way of the Lord, but this Lord is not Jesus. This Lord is God, but God is not Jesus. And this preparation is just a general readying of Israel by John for God's way to become available to them. And the way that he provides is this path to salvation through Jesus as the Messiah and whatever Mark's Christology is. Yeah. That doesn't necessitate reading Jesus as this Lord that is being prepared for. A second interpretation is that one that I already mentioned, that Mark only knows this passage in Greek, and in his interpretation, Lord is Messiah, not God, in this specific instance. So then in that case, yeah, John is preparing the way for Jesus, but he still doesn't see Jesus as God. And then a third one that I have not seen argued for, to my memory, in any commentary, but I think is valid, is that Mark is applying this passage from Isaiah and Exodus to both John and Jesus. Yeah. That each of them is a messenger who emerges in the wilderness, because Mark chapter 1 uses that phrase, in the wilderness, to refer to both John and Jesus. John comes out of the wilderness to baptize at the Jordan, and then he says Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days, and he comes out of that wilderness with his message, the kingdom of God is near. So it could be that Mark is doing a kind of Elijah-Elisha thing, where John is Elijah, but Jesus is Elisha, and he does what Elijah does, but better.
Yeah. If we zoom out some from that text, because what that the citation there to the Hebrew Bible it's not there for no reason. It's there to function as a segue between the beginning of the good news of Jesus into the ministry of John. So if we zoom out and look at the wider context, I don't know if you buy this reading, but when I read about Jesus being baptized, I read it as Jesus undergoes the same baptism that everyone else is undergoing, and that is a baptism for the remission of sins. So he is confessing his sins. He must be, and therefore, if that's the case, he can't be divine because God does not sin. Do you buy that view? Do you think this is something that Mark is doing? Do you think that...
Entirely? It may not have been something that Mark thought was an issue that needed to be clarified. It's just, this is the Messiah. The Messiah, he was baptized. Yeah. What? And what else? What do you expect? He's just narrating this continuity between John and Jesus, whatever his intention might have been. But yes, the fact that he has Jesus being baptized for the remission of sins very naturally indicates that, in his point of view, Jesus is a human who has sinned. Yeah. And this gets a little bit into my perspective on what baptism is, but the idea that baptism washes away, cleanses you, shows that Jesus is a person in need of cleansing.
Yeah.
I think the probable rebuttal to that would be, Jesus is human. Humans have a sin nature. It's washed away. According to most Christians, Jesus doesn't have a sin nature. That's why he's Jesus. Exactly. Within their theology, I mean. So I agree with you that is just an inherent part of what Mark is portraying. Yeah. That Jesus necessarily is a human capable of sin, and probably had sin by that point, according to the author's thought process.
Yeah, and I think that explains, at least that reading, the potential reading in Mark explains maybe Matthew's reaction when he redacts that text, because it is Matthew, right, who says, Jesus says to John, or John says to Jesus, I should be baptized by you, but Jesus is like, well, so there's kind of this tension in the tradition that says, well, baptism implies something about Jesus, and so Matthew modifies it. Has this conversation that we don't find in Mark, or Luke, or John for that matter, whereby Jesus is distanced from the implication made by Mark that he perhaps was a sinner.
It also coheres really well with the passage in Mark chapter 10, I think, in which Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? No one but God is good."
Yep.
That response that Jesus gives to somebody calling him good does not make sense if he's trying to say, "Yes, I am good." It only makes sense if he's denying the fact that he is good in the way God is good.
Yeah. Well, and in that passage, I don't want to get deep into that, but in that passage, the guy, the person, was it the rich young ruler? Is that who it was?
It doesn't matter.
Whoever he is, he takes the note from Jesus, because when he addresses him the second time, he drops the word good when he addresses him. So instead of being good teacher, he then just calls him teacher, because he's learned his lesson from Jesus. Okay, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't call you good. Only God is good. But either way, let's move on, because I think we kind of nailed that one. Let's move on to Mark chapter 2, because this is one that is a lot of conservative commentaries will make the point that when I'm not going to read the whole passage, but Jesus, he's in Capernaum, he's at home. They bring to him a man who is, I guess, paralyzed. He's got some kind of disability. He is brought down on a mat by his friends, and then Jesus, seeing the faith of the people that brought him, not the faith of the guy, but the faith of those who brought him, says, "Child, your sins are forgiven." And to this, the scribes just react, emotionally charged, accusing him of blasphemy, because they say, "Who is able to forgive sins except God only?" And so an interpreter, especially, Christian apologists, will say, well, the scribes have got it right. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Well, Jesus is God, therefore he can forgive sins.
Yeah.
And that was a persuasive argument when I was younger. I thought, yeah, this makes sense. But you don't think that's the case. I don't think it's the case anymore. But what do you think is actually going on here? Is that the intention of the Markan author, or is he trying to highlight something else?
So in this passage, and I think this is a really good example of the complexity of the Gospel of Mark in terms of how it was written. To begin with, I think this passage very likely originated before Mark, that the author did not invent this story. I think there are parts of Mark that have been invented, but this is one that I do not think he invented. And I think it's because specifically of that idiom, "Son of Man." The way most Christians approach the text of not just Mark, but the New Testament in general, and the book of Daniel, is that the Son of Man is Jesus, and that this Son of Man is specifically a divine Messiah, a Messiah who is God. So when they read that, Jesus' response to his accusers, "No one but God can forgive sins," and he says, "The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." Well, that just means that the Son of Man is the divine Messiah, Jesus is God, and therefore Jesus can forgive sins because he is God.
Yeah.
This is not what the story would have originally meant. Before the Gospels, before apocalyptic literature in the Second Temple era, Son of Man was just an idiom that meant human or mortal, and that's it. It means person.
Yeah.
So one Bible verse that's stuck in my brain for decades and decades is from Numbers, in which God says, "God is not a man that he should lie. he is not a son of man that he should change his mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the exact same. He's saying the same thing 2 times, but in the first time he says man, the second time he says son of man. That parallelism shows that son of man means the same thing as man. In other words, God is not a mortal person that he makes mistakes and is fickle. That's all that it's saying.
Yeah.
And we see this idiomatic use of the phrase son of man all across the Hebrew Bible, including in Daniel, where we find it in Daniel in an apocalyptic vision of symbols and allegory. Son of man, or rather one like a son of man, meaning like I saw something that looked like a person.
Yeah.
As opposed to I saw 4 things that looked like animals, a lion, a bear, a leopard, whatever this 4th thing is. He's just describing these figures in his dream, these kind of vague shifting images, and 4 of them looked like animals and one looked like a person. And that's all that means there. He's not using it as a title, which is how most Christians read it now. So then when we get to apocalyptic literature, specifically First Enoch, a portion of First Enoch is kind of an iteration on that vision in Daniel, where he's taking that vision and he's elaborating on it, and just by necessity he reuses that phrase, one like a son of man. That son of man, this son of man, the son of man. It's still not a title. He's just saying, oh, that human-like guy.
Yeah.
That's all it means. So then we finally get to the Gospels, and we see it using this phrase son of man in a lot of different ways. In some passages, it's very clearly referring to Jesus, and it's essentially a synonym for Messiah. In other parts of the Gospels, it's not clear that it means Messiah or that's referring to Jesus. And then this is a passage where I think that's the case. That this passage, whether written or oral, originated before Mark got to it and used it in his gospel. And here it uses son of man in its traditional idiomatic sense, meaning humans, any person. So when the accusers say only God can forgive sins, Jesus' response is essentially saying God has given the authority to people to forgive sins on earth. Because people are the images of God, they stand in for God, they have his authority, depending on the situation. That's all Jesus is saying, at least originally. But then Mark comes along, and for him, Jesus is the Son of Man because he has this kind of Enoch-like eschatology. So he sees that phrase and he says, oh yeah, this is about Jesus. It's about him. That still doesn't mean he's saying Jesus is God. He's just saying Jesus, as this Messiah figure, has been granted the authority by God to forgive sins. That is the upper limit of Mark's theology here. It doesn't go further and say that Jesus is God. It's just saying Jesus has authority from God.
Yeah. Yeah. He's the authoritative agent of God. Yeah. I used to read this passage and say, when the scribes respond the way they do, the scribes in Mark are, generally speaking, they're portrayed negatively. So, therefore, why would you trust them anyway? It's like this. You're not
often their accusations are wrong. It's only when it becomes theologically convenient for the Christian argument that suddenly the accusations are essentially correct.
Yeah. Although in this case, I think the logic of the passage would say that they are correct, but they're missing the part where God is designated to the Messiah the ability to forgive sins. Because I don't think this is I don't know. I'm not convinced this is a passage that Mark did not so thoroughly redact, edit, or whatever you want to call it, that it's not Like, I just don't think it's probably pre-Markan. I'm very skeptical of any kind of redactional history.
Sure.
I don't think
We
can get.
yeah, we
I don't
had
think
that debate many times on your channel.
Yeah, I don't think there's a pre-Markan passion narrative that was in vogue for a long time. It's kind of waning.
Right.
I'm always skeptical of arguments about oral tradition because you just can't get to it. We have Mark in front of us. You know, he's obviously creative. There's lots of examples, but I think here, there's a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
In my defense, for the idiomatic sense of Son of Man being used here, we look at how Matthew uses this passage, where Matthew copies from Mark and he modifies it slightly in his own little ways. One of the ways he does that is he appends this statement in which Jesus gives his response, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. And then he heals the paralyzed man. And then he notes that the crowds rejoiced because authority had been given to humans to do this.
Yeah.
Where he's using humans in the sense of Son of Man.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Yeah.
So at the very least, in the late first century or whenever exactly Matthew was written, at least one Christian reading Mark understood it where Son of Man was more idiomatic and not just Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. That is a fair point. Yeah, so there are other examples in the early Christian tradition of the forgiveness of sins, being undertaken by people. In fact, the logic of the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That word trespass is really just a synonym for a kind of sin. So the idea that you can forgive sins of others is perfectly coheres with what Jesus is saying. There's nothing special about it. And even in the Gospel of John, is it post-resurrection where he gives the disciples the authority to forgive sins?
Yep. You could even point to the passages where he says, here's the kingdoms of the kingdom, or here are the keys to the kingdom. You have the authority to bind and loose. That's more or less the same topic.
Yeah, exactly.
If Jesus can grant this authority to others, why can't God grant it to Jesus in the first place?
Yeah, well, precisely. Yeah, exactly. So there nothing about this passage necessitates a reading that makes Jesus on par with God the Father. So
right. In general, since we're at that point, I would say that is how I read most of Mark. Yeah. That in any given context where it appears at a glance through a much later Christian perspective that the author is saying Jesus is God, almost invariably there is another more sensible reading where Jesus is portrayed as the agent of God, a figure who has been endowed with God's authority because he's special.
Yep. I completely agree. In fact, one of the books that really influenced me in this direction was J.R. Daniel Kirk's A Man Attested by God, Human Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels. Fantastic. It's a lengthy book, but he does a really...
I always had that on my list to get around to, and I never read it.
You have got to read it. He lays out the arguments well, and it's just a classic. Like, it's just a modern classic. Let's move on to a third text that I wanted to talk about. This comes toward the end of the Gospel of Mark. And this is definitely one that I've seen used to argue for the deity of Christ. So this is from Mark chapter 14. Let me read verses 61 and 62. So this is Jesus is before the council, before the high priest. He's being questioned, and so the high priest asks him in verse 61 of Mark chapter 14, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Verse 62, Jesus said, "I am." And a lot of people read that and will say, see?
I want you to read the next part of the passage, though.
I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Um, so, first of all, uh, I am, ego, eimi,
Yep.
used in the Gospel of John frequently and often taken to be an indication that he is Yahweh, that he is the I am of Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Um, and many Christian apologists use this argument. I wrote a blog post responding to this argument. Well, it was one of many, but this was in there. Why? What is going on here? Is Jesus actually affirming his own deity? Is he claiming to be divine before the high priest?
No.
Why?
So there are 2 points that are often used: the I am, ego eimi, and the reference to the Son of Man coming on the clouds, seated at the right hand of power.
Yeah.
I would, you have to tackle each of them separately, even though they're given in one statement.
Yeah.
And I think it's necessary just to hit that second point first. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. This is very obviously a reference to Daniel chapter 7, that apocalyptic vision we've already talked about, where the Son of Man in that passage is just a symbolic reference to a human-like figure. In the book of Daniel, that Son of Man figure is a representation of Israel as a whole, just as the 4 monsters represent 4 Gentile civilizations. And the summary of that passage is Israel will come out on top over the Gentiles. God will favor his people, the ones that he chose. There is no reference to a Messiah in Daniel chapter 7.
Yeah.
The first time that we know of where this Son of Man is interpreted as the Messiah is the book of Enoch, which has definitely very heavily influenced the Gospel of Mark.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe not directly, although I think that is likely. So there's no question that Mark is intending Son of Man here to operate as a messianic reference, if not a title. Regardless of that, it does not mean this Son of Man is depicted as God, because in Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man is given his kingdom by God.
Yeah.
He does not innately have this authority or power. Just as here, Jesus says the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power. You're not the right hand man of yourself. You are the right hand man of somebody superior to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't think there is any interpretation of the Son of Man phrase that is valid when it takes it as a reference to a divine God Messiah. Maybe a divine Messiah, but not a God Messiah.
Yeah.
But I qualify it that way because we can use that phrase or that word divine in a lot of ways more than just equals God.
Yes.
Angels are divine. Even in a sense, demons are divine. They're just bad angels, according to most Christians. So if we do have a divine Messiah, it doesn't mean he's a God Messiah. It just means that he is a Messiah who in some capacity has been granted or born with or created with a divine nature in the way that an angel might. That's out of the way. The bigger one is the first point, which is ego eimi, I am, where Jesus just responds, I am. And apologists tend to read this as a self-declaration of full divinity, full deity. He is Yahweh, the God. And I think that's absurd. And I'm sorry to say it so bluntly and almost condescendingly, but how else is a person such as Jesus, if he is just human, how else is he supposed to just use a self-declaration? Is he not allowed to use the phrase "I am" if he's not God?
Yeah.
Everybody on earth uses a self-declaration at any given day. It doesn't mean they're claiming to be the divine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's point number one regarding ego eimi, I am. The second point is, and I make this same argument whenever the topic of John 8:58 comes up, where Jesus says, "I am," in response to some of his accusers. Both the Gospel of John and, at least as far as I know, and the Gospel of Mark are using the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. They are not quoting from Exodus. They are quoting from a Greek translation of Exodus. And
Yes.
in that Greek translation, "I am" is not the divine name of Yahweh. In the Greek version, Yahweh says, "Ego eimi hoon," or however you say it in Greek. "I am the being," or the existent one. And then he tells Moses, and sorry, getting a little bit jumbled in my brain. In the Hebrew text of Exodus 3, Moses asks Yahweh, "Who shall I tell the Israelites sent me? What name should I give them?" And Yahweh says, "Tell them, Ayeh Asher Ayeh. I will be who I will be sent you." And then he abbreviates that phrase as just the phrase "I will be," or "I am" in some translations.
Yeah.
In the Greek version of this, Moses asks his question, and Yahweh says, "Tell them, I am the being sent you." But then when he gets to that second part of the response, he doesn't say, "I am," he says, "the being." So in Exodus chapter 3, in the Greek version, the being, hoon, is the identifying name of Yahweh beyond the word Yahweh. But everybody, for whatever reason, latches onto ego eimi, the first half of the phrase, which is not the important part in Exodus 3 Septuagint.
Yeah.
So it's the whole thing is kind of a red herring, or it's not the part of the text that's important for anybody reading the Greek copy, which is what Mark was reading, and John. So even if Jesus does say ego eimi, it's completely irrelevant to any connection to Exodus 3. It means he's not referencing that passage. He's not saying, "Hey, look over there. That's me, that guy in the burning bush."
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's absolutely correct. It's I think it's also in John, the man born blind uses the phrase "ego eimi" when
Yes.
he's asked the question, "Are you the one who was?" And he says, "Ego eimi." Well, is he declaring himself to be the divine Son of God? No, of course not. He's just identifying himself as the person that they're seeking.
He's given an affirmative answer to a question that he is asked about his identity.
Exactly.
Just as Jesus is here.
Yeah. Yeah. You could colloquially, I think I mispronounced that word. Wow. Render it as like, "It's me,"
Yeah.
Because also in Mark, ego eimi is used when Jesus is walking on the water, passing he intends to pass the disciples as they're in the boat freaking out, and he tells them, "Ego eimi, don't be afraid." He's just me. Hey, it's me, guys. There's nothing to worry about. Yeah. I think you're right. I think there's this overemphasis on this rather innocuous ego eimi. It's not that important. Now that being said, the Gospel of John does elevate the term because he connects it to, like you earlier we talked about, "I am the door," or "I am the good but it's never ego eimi. It's ego eimi, this
or that.
Yeah, there's an objective complement to it.
I think there's a secondary element that is often overlooked even in commentaries, as far as I've seen, that if you take I am to be a reference to the divine name in Exodus 3, like if you're reading John 8 or Mark 14, in which Jesus says, ego e me, and you read that as, oh, he's declaring himself Yahweh. Okay, well, that means he's using ego e me sort of as a name, in which case he's not answering any question. He's just saying, Yahweh.
Yeah. What good is that?
How is that an answer? That doesn't answer anything. So
Yeah.
then does that mean anybody who says ego e me is saying Yahweh?
Yeah.
It's just this weird grammatical, illogical way of reading a very mundane phrase.
Yeah. It'd be the same. Yeah. If you asked me, a question like, what, did you have the fish for dinner, Benjamin?
Right.
Or I mean, like, it's that kind of non-answer.
Or even if somebody just says, hey Jesus, are you hungry? Ego e me. Yeah, he's saying he's hungry. He's not saying God.
Yeah, exactly. R.T. France, in his commentary on Mark, and he was a Catholic, an Anglican, commentator, and even he looks at this passage, and he says the idea that this is a reference to the divine name is just not what's going on here. How else is he to affirm what the questioner, what the priest is asking him? And I think it's France, but he makes the point that so in Greek the priest asks, he says, Su eha Christas ha huyas to eulagetu, which is to say, you are the Christ, the Son of the Blessed. Like it's almost like he's flabbergasted by Jesus being before him. You're the guy, and Jesus says, "Yeah, ego e me. I'm him. That's me." It's just an innocuous response that is designed to identify Jesus as the one the chief priest finds absurd that he's the Messiah. So, but there's another issue though with this passage. So in verse 64. Well, verse 63 and verse 64, the high priest has a very visceral reaction to Jesus's, acclamation about his identity as the Son of Man. He tears his garments, and then he says that he's committed blasphemy. And so, and I'm sure you've come across this argument that some apologists will say that he would not have accused him of blasphemy unless he understood Jesus to be claiming to be God. Do you think that's why? Like he's the charge of blasphemy comes up. What's going on with that?
I think there are two other valid interpretations. Again, two other more sensible interpretations. One is the author of Mark is almost entirely inventing this chapter's content. Mm-hmm. He has a very broad, historically accurate outline. Jesus was arrested, he was put on trial, and he was crucified. But all of the details he's mostly making up. And I think that this trial scene by the high priest and the Sanhedrin, and that is what it is. It is a trial against people such as Darrell Bach, who argue it's an informal examination. That's not what this is. I think given that the author is making up a lot of this content for the chapter, I think it's entirely possible he simply did not know what blasphemy was defined as in Jewish law.
Okay.
Because it is not blasphemous to claim to be the Messiah. And it is not blasphemous to say the phrase, I am.
Yeah.
And it's not blasphemous to pronounce judgment on the high priest. Which is essentially what he's saying when he responds with, and you will see the Son of Man. So, like, that's kind of a threat.
Yeah.
It's not blasphemous to do that. If anything, Jesus avoids blasphemy by saying he will be seated at the right hand of the power instead of saying God or Yahweh.
Yeah, he's distanced himself from, yeah.
So I think it's entirely probable that Mark either did not know or did not care what blasphemy consisted of in Jewish law. That his end goal is to get Jesus crucified because Jesus was crucified.
Yeah.
And the details of how his narrative gets there are being, if you want to be kind, he's tweaking history in favor of his theology.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Instead of that, another interpretation that I think is valid, but I personally do not find as compelling, is that he was fully aware of a variety of definitions of what blasphemy constituted in Jewish law, and he is appealing to one of those. But in general, given the author's broader apparent ignorance of Jewish concerns in the gospel, I don't think that's quite as likely. But if that is an accurate reading, the charge of blasphemy is essentially just the fact that Jesus is he's being accused of blasphemy because he's abusing the authority of God in conversation, and by claiming God's authority being invested in himself.
Okay.
That the blasphemy is God would dare to authorize you. You're a heretic. You do this and that, and all these things you're saying are false, and we don't agree with you. That means you're blasphemous.
Yeah. Who is this guy? Yeah, exactly. Okay. I was trying to pull up Adele Yarbrough Collins, because she talks about, or I thought she talked about blasphemy in this passage, and I thought maybe it's not her. Let's see.
She does.
Yeah, I'm looking at it. I thought nothing is highlighted. I used to have stuff highlighted, and I can't seem to find that stuff. Well, okay, yeah, so she says evidence for the currency of a broader understanding of blasphemy in the late Second Temple period is provided by Philo. So she lists example. So yeah, she's arguing that the idea of blasphemy is more expansive than just you're claiming to be divine. It includes other things that do not approach the severity of what that would be. So yeah, either way, it's not an argument that holds any water for sure. Well, those are the three main passages that I wanted to look at. Did you mention a fourth passage? I can't remember.
Oh, the one in which Jesus denies being good as God.
Oh yeah, that's chapter 12 or chapter 11.
I think chapter 10. I could be wrong.
Is it 10? Let's see. Yes, it is chapter 10. Yeah. So, all right. So Mark chapter 10. This is verses 17 and following. There's a man who runs up to Jesus, bows before him, and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responds, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." So obviously, Mark, it must be that Jesus is saying he's God because he's good. That's the logic of the passage. But we've alluded to this before. Let's kind of dig into it a little bit more. What is actually going on in this passage?
The person addressing Jesus is trying to exalt him. He's trying to elevate his importance, and from Jesus' response, Jesus thinks this is inappropriate. That whatever Jesus might be, Messiah, angel incarnate, whatever you want to call him, or even just a general prophet and sage and not a Messiah, which is the interpretation some scholars have of Jesus in Mark. Whatever the case, Jesus is saying, yeah, there is this thing about that, there is this attribute that only God has, and it's that God is good. And that's not me.
Yeah.
I think this goes really well with the passage of Jesus being baptized for the remission of sins, that Jesus is denying that he is on the level of God. If anything, this could be a counterpoint against the idea that Jesus commits blasphemy, because he's very, very careful to attribute to God alone what he thinks God alone, like what qualifies God as God and what other beings do not have.
Yeah.
And in this case, I think it's very clear Jesus is denying he is good the way God is. He might be good in some perhaps moral sense, maybe in the sense that he follows the Torah, or maybe in the sense that he knows when to ask for forgiveness or to be baptized or whatever. But whatever that might be, he has this category of good. Only God is in it, and he is not in it. Jesus is not in that category.
Yep. Yeah. And as earlier I mentioned that when Jesus tells him, you got to keep the commandments, do this, do that, the other. When the man responds again to Jesus, he drops the word good. He just calls him teacher. He's, that's a narrative clue that this is not, this is Jesus. He knows what Jesus is talking about. He's like, oh yeah, you're right. Only God is good. So yeah, I think that's probably
the way Christian theologians and Christian interpreters in general tackle this. It reminds me of the way they interact with the passage about the eye of the needle, the camel going through the eye of the needle, where you have the text, you have what is very obviously what it is saying, and then you have later interpreters trying to turn it around to say what it's clearly not.
Yeah.
Where in this case, you have Jesus saying, "I'm good as God is alone good. Don't call me good. God is good. I'm not in that category." So then you have interpreters later trying to read it according to their theology, and their theology says Jesus is God, so they have to read it in a way that, oh, the reason you're calling me good is because I'm God. God alone is good, and you called me good, that means I'm him.
Exactly.
Which is not what the text is. So then you have that other one with the camel going through the eye of the needle. God alone can save anybody. A rich man being saved is like a camel trying to fit through the eye of a needle. In other words, it's impossible without God.
Exactly.
But then you have interpreters who find this offensive in some way because they want to be wealthy, or they are wealthy, and they want to excuse their wealth. And they instead try to come up with this bizarre interpretation that somehow without God, rich people can be saved without God. It's just really, really hard.
Yeah.
Because the eye of the needle is the name for some gate in the wall of Jerusalem that only camels could fit through if they went down on their knees and crouched through, which camels don't really do.
No.
Except there's no evidence that this gate ever existed at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just such a counterintuitive way of reading that passage. If it's weird about this thing with the eye of the needle, then it's weird about this way where Jesus denies being called good.
And can you imagine, like, if that was Jesus's point, nobody picked up on it. Like if his point was to say I am God, nobody in the text recognizes that fact. It would be such a bizarre, but only I, the interpreter, 2,000 years later, can pick up on that. No, this had to have some meaning to the original readers of the text, and it certainly was not. Oh, yeah, he's proclaiming his own deity. No, he's like you said, he's being a good Jew and affirming the goodness of the one God.
Right.
So there's all these narrative clues that. This is one of the things that I find.
Wait, I have to correct you.
Oh,
He was being a good Christian.
yeah, my mistake. My mistake. But one of the problems I really have with a lot of what passes for Christian apologetics is it's always this isolated cherry picking, reading of these texts and ignoring the details that surround them.
Yeah.
Because it's the details that help inform your interpretation. And if you are, like you said, if you have this theological bent and you're trying to interpret these texts in a way that conforms to that, the details don't matter. It's the theology that matters. You're just using the Bible as a pretext. But when you zoom out and you take into account everything that's in there, you get a better glimpse of what is actually going on, what the author is intending to communicate.
I think that's probably why biblical studies, from a quote unquote neutral perspective, is so hard, because so much of the media available for studying it, whether that's videos on YouTube or articles on the internet or legitimate articles in journals or commentaries or whatever, the vast majority of that is written and produced by Christians for Christians.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of them are reiterating and repeating and reimagining their theology as the framework that you approach this text by, rather than according to its own time period, and taking into account this vast wealth of data contemporary to those texts that informs what they're probably saying and not what this later theology says it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it just tends to be the problem of, like, everyone comes to the text with a bias. It's inevitable. You can't avoid it. But there are strategies to, kind of not to minimize it, to reduce its effect. And reading theology from the 4th century or whatever into it is not the way to go. Try to read the text in its own terms. Well, we've what are we at? We are well over an hour. So we've hit, I think, some of the main, some of the bigger texts in the Gospel of Mark that are often used to promote the idea that Jesus is God.
There's some other really, really interesting ones for this topic about the divinity of Jesus, and they're definitely worth digging into. But yeah, these are the big ones, the ones near the start. They're the ones that apologists go through step by step. Yeah. And like you said, they kind of cherry pick.
Yeah, they tend to avoid context as much as possible. But yeah. So to round out this episode, like we tend to do, and now that you have an actual answer, what have you been reading lately? What's caught your eye?
So like I said before, did I say that before? Yep. That I've been trying to branch out a bit, read some things outside the Bible that are related to religion and philosophy, just for partly for myself betterment, to broaden my thinking, but also just to see what's out there that I've been missing out on. So, for example, and I have some of these books right here on my desk waiting to show. I have The Stranger by Albert Camus, French philosopher, if I couldn't get any more pretentious. I really enjoyed that book. Kind of a weird ending. It's definitely more allegorical than it is a narrative. But I'll probably have to reread it to really get his point. I also read his short story that is almost the length of a novel, The Artist at Work, where it's about a painter, and this painter character is more or less a stand-in for Albert Camus himself, and his efforts to just explore what he wants to explore, regardless of what people expect of him. I also recently got these two books, which I think are just fantastic. Indian Spirituality by Joshua R. Paskowitz, and Zen Buddhism, also by Joshua R. Paskowitz, where I'm just really ignorant of Indian religion.
Yeah. I mean,
Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. And then the second book on Zen Buddhism, I picked up, actually bought that first just because I've been personally exploring Zen. I just find it appealing. I reread Marcus Aurelius again, and man, I hate Stoicism. Stoicism feels like Zen Buddhism, and it feels like Taoism. But at least in Marcus Aurelius's version, his Stoicism seems to be about reinforcing the social hierarchy, even though he just happens to be at the top of that hierarchy.
Yeah, lucky him, huh?
So, speaking of that, I have been reading the Tao Te Ching, which is the primary text of Taoism, and if I understand correctly, was a major influence on the development of Zen Buddhism. And adjacent to that, I had been reading the Books of Earthsea, which is massive.
Oh my goodness.
By Ursula K. Le Guin, who was a Taoist.
Oh, okay. That must be fiction, right?
Yes. The original book, A Wizard of Earthsea, I believe it released in 1968, so about 10 years after Lord of the Rings, but where Lord of the Rings is European-style fantasy, the Earthsea setting is more Polynesian, Pacific Islander fantasy. So it's a very, very different setting.
Yeah, I've never heard of that. Yeah.
I read the original book probably 25 or 30 years ago, and I really liked it, and I knew there were sequels, and I always wanted to read them. So now I'm rereading the Wizard of Earthsea right now, and then the rest of that volume is the sequels to that book.
Sounds like some interesting reading. Have you? We mentioned we texted about this, but the upcoming Nick Cage movie, The Carpenter's Son.
Yes.
Thoughts?
I'm usually not one for horror movies, but when it comes to Nick Cage, I'm always willing to make an exception. I was telling some friends about this movie after you informed me of it, and their response was immensely negative.
Oh, no.
One of them said, "Oh, Nick Cage was on such a roll. Why is he doing this?"
Oh.
And the other one said, "No, not more Bible slop."
Well, it's not Bible slop.
It's Apocrypha slop. I clarified. Yes, this movie it's based on the infancy Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
Correct?
That's
which I've read a couple of times, but I'm not as familiar with other than its general reputation as its depiction of Jesus as a cosmic brat.
Yeah.
But interesting. I think I did mention before that I've been trying to read these other religion texts and be more informed to hopefully open my thought process about how I read the Bible, not necessarily to find a connection between them, but just to get my brain working in a different way. The Tao Te Ching, reading through it actually did make me re-evaluate the way I read the Gospel of Thomas, which is my favorite gospel. Not the infancy Gospel of Thomas, just the regular one, in which each chapter is just a kind of compartmentalized teaching from Jesus.
Yeah.
Especially the more esoteric, you could call them proto-Gnostic, although I don't like that term, parts of the Gospel of Thomas. They read to me very similarly to, perhaps not the Tao Te Ching. The format, yes, but the content actually makes me think a bit of the way Zen Buddhism looks at the world, which once I had been studying that and looking into that, it was just kind of an interesting parallel.
Interesting. Well, good. All right. Well,
what about you? What are you reading?
Oh, well, I am.
We can't conclude without your book recommendations.
Yeah. So I've been reading the recently published book, The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus.
Is this the fourth one now? The fourth quest?
Yeah. It's been pretty good. It's got some really good contributions from like Mark Goodacre and Chris Keith. Some of the chapters are more interesting than others, but it's been pretty good. I'm also reading Jill Lepore's book, These Truths, which is like a broad history of the United States, and that's been really good. But the book that I've been really enjoying is Stephen King's The Stand. So
of course.
I don't know if you've read it or know anything about it, but like it's set in this, it's America, but it's like post a virus that wipes out 99% of the world's population, and it's a story about good and evil, and it's just really good. It's a really good story. So it's taken me pretty much all year to read because it's about 1,200 pages. So I'll read it and I'll be like, I need a palate cleanser, so I'll read some other horror book, to kind of, and then I'll come back to it. But it's lately I've been really into it. It's supposed to be adapted. Someone is going to make a new movie of it soon. Speaking of which, my wife and I went to the movie theaters last week and saw The Long Walk, which is another Stephen King adapted story.
Yeah.
And that was really good. Really good. Kind of post-apocalyptic. Well, no, it's actually a post-war. But it's got Mark Hamill.
Apocalypse.
Let's say what?
Aren't the post-war periods post-apocalyptic?
Pretty much. But Mark Hamill's in it. He plays like the main villain, I guess you could call him. And I love Mark Hamill. I just big fan. So, but yeah, that's been going on. What's been going on with my reading, and then that movie was really good. But I love Stephen King, so I'm obligated to mention Stephen King stuff.
Sure.
But so, all right. Well, we're gonna wrap it up here. Mark, thanks for doing this, taking my questions, and talking about the Gospel of Mark, which is my favorite. Thanks
gospel. For letting me ramble.
Yeah. Well, you don't ramble. I ramble. I do that a lot. You can ask my kids. Scatterbrained. And I wasn't able to take any notes today because, oh God, what a day it's been. Just what a day. But yeah, so in any event, for those who are watching this, I'll be sure to put in the show notes links to some of the blog posts that Mark has written, and anything else that I may have missed that would be pertinent to the conversation that we've had. Also, the recommendation to J.R. Daniel Kirk's book, because it is a phenomenal book. Everyone should read it. I think it does a really good job of addressing how the synoptic authors understood Jesus. Just really good book. So I'll put that in the show notes. So, Mark, thanks again, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.